I really want to thank just both of you for your public witness in terms of helping people to go deeper into their faith, because, I think so often the temptation on social media is to get caught up in these polemics, and even, defending Pope Francis can become a polemic. And so to show people that, we're not just advocating one side or another, but we're actually trying, to work on our own holiness and to help others grow in that. I think you both are doing wonderful work in that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, maybe that's a perfect place to begin and open with that, and we can sort of trim off anything else.
Absolutely, sure.
We'll start with the nice things.
There you
Excellent.
go. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Pope Francis Generation. Hi, Paul. Good to have you with us. And today we're joined by Dawn, Eden Goldstein. Welcome, Dawn. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be on. Thank you for having me.
Paul, today's topic is, drum roll.
Yeah, it's speaking to anti-Semitism that is within the church, a little bit historically. We're going to talk a little bit about G.K. Chesterton, but also in the present day, where do we still see anti-Semitism, unfortunately, within the Catholic Church? And Dawn's been talking about this for a few years and has her own personal experiences to share as well. So we are really excited to have her on.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued in this because either I have been following you, Dawn, for a while, or I've seen some of your posts on Chesterton, and I have not read enough of Chesterton to where I got to those points where you're highlighting some of his very serious flaws and his comments and stuff. I discovered him in college and immediately fell in love with him, like a lot of people have done. But then also this past weekend, I was reading a book on was the Everlasting People, which was sort of a riff on his Everlasting Man, but in light of First Nations here in the United States.
Wow.
And the author, Matthew Milliner, is a Methodist, made this fascinating point, which I hadn't considered, that Chesterton in his 30s was different to him in his 50s, and how a lot of his polemical attitudes in his younger years were tempered in his later years. And so he also then pointed out how Chesterton has been like taken by so many over on the, I don't know what you'd call them, deep right or alt-conservative or something, and that his name has become synonymous with certain attitudes in the church. And so when Paul mentioned this conversation and then anti-Semitism, I confess my first reaction was, I'm surprised this is still a thing today, because I'm just not exposed to circles where it keeps coming up, mostly because I try to stay off of Twitter. For me, I'm looking forward to this conversation with you and Paul to get sort of a pulse check on where the church is, and the fact that you don't have to be a Nazi to be anti-Semitic, but it's a spectrum of an issue, and that we have a responsibility to this. And then there's your own stories and experiences in all of this. So Paul, well, let's intro it in. I'll punt it back over to Paul. So friends, welcome to Pope Francis Generation. It's the show for Catholics struggling with the church's teaching, who feel like they might not belong in the church anymore, and who still hunger for a God of love and goodness.
Your hosts are me, Paul Fahey, a professional catechist.
And I'm Dominic, someone who needs catechesis. Together, we're taking our own look at the Catholic Church, her teachings and practices from three views that changed our world.
And those are the Kerygma, the doctrine of theosis, and the teachings of Pope Francis.
Together with you, we're the Pope Francis Generation.
Yeah, so I want to read Dawn's bio real quick. So Eden Goldstein is the author of Father Ed, the story of Bill W.'s spiritual sponsor, along with several other books, including The Thrill of the Chaste and My Peace I Give You, Healing Sexual Wounds with the Help of the Saints. Together, her books have sold more than 60,000 copies worldwide and in 10 languages. Dr. Goldstein began her working life as a rock and roll historian and went on to editorial positions at the New York Post and the Daily News before publishing her first book in 2006. In 2016, she became the first woman to earn a doctorate in sacred theology from the University of St. Mary of the Lake. She has taught at universities and seminaries in the U.S., England, and India, and today she lives in Washington, D.C., where she recently received a degree in canon law at Catholic University of America. Dawn, that's a fantastic bio. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, gosh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. So I've been following you for several years, and I've really valued the perspectives that you bring to current discussions within the church. I've especially appreciated your love for Pope Francis and your your willingness to support and explain his teaching publicly in the U.S. Church, I found that to be especially valuable.
Thank you.
To get our discussion going, just from your bio, I want to hear your story, because you have like rock and roll historian, theologian, canon lawyer. You're also an adult convert to Catholicism. I feel like we could spend just a few hours talking about your story, but in just a few minutes, I'd love to hear that.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I'm delighted to. And for anyone who wants a longer version of the story, there's my memoir called "Sunday Will Never Be the Same: A Rock and Roll Journalist Opens Her Ears to God." But yes, the short version is that I'm Generation X. I grew up in a Reformed Jewish household, Reformed Judaism being a more liberal branch of Judaism. So I did not grow up Orthodox. My parents divorced when I was a kid. I was raised by my mom, and when I was 13, I was a bat mitzvah. That's when in a Jewish household, a child basically leads a worship service to show that he or she has come of age in Judaism, and after that, I pretty much lost my faith. I became an agnostic. When I read things that I wrote, like in journals as a teen and in my 20s, I see that I never was able to really erase from my conscience the idea that there was a God, that there was some sort of providence, although I probably wouldn't have called it that. But I did, just fundamentally come to think that if there was a God, that God must not care about me, that God had in some way forgotten me. And I, many years later, in my 30s, after I'd become Catholic, I finally went to a good therapist and found out that I had post-traumatic stress disorder brought on by several traumas that I suffered in childhood, including childhood sexual abuse, and certainly traumas can cause someone to feel forgotten by God. So into my 20s, I became a rock and roll journalist, historian, but I was searching. I had this kind of existential loneliness and sadness and really wanting God. In the meantime, strangely enough, my mother actually became Catholic. And she actually became Catholic after I encouraged her to read the Bible, because I was sick of her New Age stuff. We were at a college campus, and when I was looking at colleges as a teenager, and she found a Good News Bible at the student center that was being offered at a Christian table, and she's like, what do you think, Don? Should I read this? And I'm like, yes, Mom, you need to read that, because I just thought, why can't I have a normal house? Because by that time, Mom was going every week to hear a guru named Hilda who said that aliens were coming, and so I just thought, this is cool. Mom can pick up Christianity and I'll have a normal life. But well, I 1 out of 2 wasn't bad anyway. She picked up Christianity. She was still her own fun self. Thanks be to God. But yeah, the Christianity did not rub off on me. When I was 27 and doing a phone interview with a member of a rock band called the Sugar Plastic, I asked him what he was reading these days, and he mentioned this author and this book that I had never heard of. It was G.K. Chesterton, The Man Who Was Thursday. And so I, just thinking, well, I'll impress him, the next time he comes to town, by having read this book, I walked down the street to my local Barnes and Noble. That tells you how long ago it was. That not only did I walk down the street to my Barnes and Noble in Hoboken, New Jersey, but they actually had a copy of The Man Who Was Thursday on the shelf. Even today, that seems like, wow, how does that ever happen? You walk into a bookstore and they have a book from 100 years ago that's in print and on their shelf. Anyway, so I picked that up and I got really into Chesterton. Even, as still an agnostic Reform Jew, I was reading Chesterton, and I was writing to Dale Ahlquist, the president of the American Chesterton Society, who had just gone online with his Chesterton Society website. He later told me that at that time that I contacted him, he wasn't even Catholic yet. He's now known as this, as this, uber, Catholic head of a Catholic schools network. But back then he was still on his way. And so, I mean, it tells you kind of where I've kind of grown along the curve of other people in this little Catholic bubble that we're part of. Anyway, so I did get moved from reading Chesterton to reading the Bible, rereading it, and I decided, after having this powerful faith experience in 1999, that I was going to get baptized, but I was going to be Protestant because Catholicism had rules, and I didn't like rules. But thankfully, God had other plans, and it was actually through the church's teachings on the dignity of human life that I was ultimately moved to enter the church in 2006, because I now realize, I think that even though I knew about the abuse crisis that had happened in the church, I felt strongly that if the church had, rather, if all people had followed what the church believes with regard to the dignity of human life, I would never have suffered abuse as a child, and my whole life would have been different. So, I knew that it's not just Catholics who have committed abuse. My own first time I suffered abuse was actually by a janitor in the Reformed Jewish temple that I attended. So I kind of was prepared, thinking like, okay, I know I'm entering a sinful church, at least in its human dimension, but these teachings are the teachings that I want to live by and that everyone should live by. So that was what brought me in, and ultimately ended up studying theology and becoming an academic and an author. And like so many people who become Catholic, I every day am appalled by some of the things that I see in the Catholic Church, not just from clergy, but from lay people. But, like even, Graham Greene, although hopefully a bit more devotional than he was, I'm caught, there's nowhere else to go. I know what else is out there besides the church. This is it, and thanks be to God, I'm here, whether the rest of the church wants me or not.
Thank you. That's an incredible story. I'm curious. You recently got a canon law degree.
Yes.
And I mean, I know a few canon lawyers, and I still don't know why anyone would want a canon law degree. So maybe you can.
I have one, and I don't know why. Well, one thing I did learn while studying for canon law, for my degree in canon law during the pandemic, was that it took me very little time to realize that I do not want to work full time in that field. But I'm very glad that I have that degree. First of all, it helped me in writing my biography of Father Edward Dowling. It's helped me in other writing that I've done since then. It really helps to know how stuff works, like, a medical student or even a veterinary student may not want to see dissected bodies, but it's important in terms of knowing how to make things right, how to help people heal. And likewise with canon law, it's not a pretty field by any means. Canon law is not pretty, like to paraphrase Steve Martin on comedy, but still, it's important, and knowing it as a theologian can also help me to understand, how to stay on the right track. In the pontificate of Pope Francis, now more than ever, sadly, there are people who will, for example, not understand levels of magisterium in terms of levels of authority of teaching, but also not understand what the church can do and what the church, can't do. From everything from, the teaching on women's ordination, why the church has taught that it does not have the authority to ordain women's priests, to teachings on other hot button issues like same-sex marriage, but also with regard to teaching on reception of the Eucharist for divorced and remarried, and there are some things that might surprise people if they actually studied, what does canon law teach on certain things, or on reception of sacraments by non-Catholics. In some ways, we are, stricter than the popular imagination thinks. In some ways, we're actually a lot looser. and so having a canon law degree helped me to understand that. Most of all, it just helps me to advise people, friends, just people who come to me, on protection of rights, which is important in any bureaucracy. And the people of God have not always had their rights honored within the church that's supposed to be with them, for them, and that they comprise. So I'm glad to be able to help in that area.
That's, I think, the best answer I've heard to why someone would want to study canon law.
Thank you.
Yeah, my own experience with canon law is I took a class one summer at my diocesan tribunal on how to be an advocate for people seeking annulments.
That's great.
And I left that class with way more questions than when I entered, and
Oh gosh.
even more confused. But okay. In any case, I'm really happy to have you on, and your background in particular gives you experiential authority to speak to the topic that we're discussing today, which is anti-Semitism within the Catholic Church. So I think to start, as we move in, there's the question of why is this topic important to you, and your biography gives some hint to that. But then also here, like, what is anti-Semitism? And as Dominic alluded to at the beginning, it isn't just being a Nazi, that there is degrees of anti-Semitism, and it plays out in different ways. So that's a few things I'm throwing at you at once. You can tackle them as you want.
Sure. So, as I shared with you before we went, on air, I just kind of came off a big ghostwriting project. Normally, before attempting to speak authoritatively on any theological issue or other, issues, I would have just gotten up to speed. I have studied anti-Semitism in the past. I've studied the church's teachings on Catholic relations with Jewish people and the Catholic theological understanding of Jewish people. I'm a little more confident speaking on that because that's something that I've taught about, so it's a little fresher in my mind. But still, before I say anything on this topic, apart from, as I shared with you, waving my hands and pointing to Nostra Aetate, which is the Vatican II document on the church's relations with non-Christian religions, including Judaism. Apart from pointing to that document, Nostra Aetate of Vatican II, that everyone should read, I don't want to pretend to be well read up on the technical aspects of this. But, you were saying about the question of anti-Semitism, is it just, being a Nazi? Is everyone anti-Semitic a Nazi? And, you suggested that there is as with racism and other prejudices, that there's a spectrum. And I would certainly agree with respect to anti-Semitism. The very word anti-Semitism is a problematic word because the way it was coined, it implies that that Jews are necessarily Semites, which is like a geographical term, I think, and actually, in fact, Arabs are Semites too, and there are all these different people who are Semites. So I think that's why anti-Semitism is now no longer being spelled like officially by groups such as the Anti-Defamation League. I think the preference now is to no longer put capital S Semitism, but just to make it all one word lowercase, to kind of make it clear that it's not a geographical term. So anti-Semitism, it means anti-Judaism. And it means not merely thinking, well, put it this way, somebody could say, well, I'm not Jewish, I have no desire to be Jewish. Does that make me anti-Jewish? No, it doesn't. Just, it doesn't any more than being of a, particular ethnic background makes you anti-other ethnic backgrounds. That alone, or being one religion, being Catholic and not identifying as Jewish, that doesn't make you anti-Semitic. Being anti-Semitic means harboring prejudices and harboring ideas and generalizations about Judaism and Jewish people that aren't rooted in fact. Then there becomes the question, well, I've met 5 Jewish people in my life and they all have these characteristics, or so on, and I don't like those characteristics, so am I anti-Semitic? Well, yes, if you are generalizing based on the individuals and negative qualities in them, then yes, that is anti-Semitic. So that's one aspect. But on a less humorous note, a more serious note, the church teaches and has taught since its earliest foundations that Catholicism cannot be understood apart from Judaism. One of the earliest heresies in the Catholic Church was Marcionism, which attempted to put forth that the idea that the Christian dispensation, the good news of Christianity, was something so completely separate from Judaism that it couldn't even be thought of in the context of Judaism. And so in order to put that across, Marcion, the founder of Marcionism, had to actually cut out sections of the New Testament and really limit the Christian section or I guess, how can I put it? For Christians, the whole Bible is our faith, but Marcion had to even limit those sections of sacred scripture that were written after Christ. He couldn't retain those if he was trying to maintain that that Catholic faith was something other than Jewish faith, because the early Christians themselves, and this is so evident in the New Testament, they worshiped at the temple. They went to Solomon's porch on the temple and worshiped there. They worshiped at the temple until they were kicked out of the temple. They thought that they were Jews. So the earliest meetings of what we would now call sort of proto-church councils were over how to understand the relations between Jewish Christians and pagan Christians, because they were all Christians. So the church has always understood that our Catholic faith is just unthinkable without the Jewish background. Jesus identified himself as the Jewish Messiah. He was born and lived and died an observant Jew. Now, his idea of being observant was different on some levels from people of his time, because he was trying to point the Jews of his time to an observance of the spirit of the law, not merely what they took to be the letter of the law. But he still, added that not one jot or one tittle of the law, not even like the smallest part of the word of the law, would perish until he had fulfilled everything through his life, death, and resurrection and ascension into heaven. With regard to the problem of anti-Semitism among Catholics today, there have been polls that show that a large number, either a majority or plurality of Catholics, and here I have to be careful because I don't have the figures right in front of me, but a frighteningly large number of Catholics think of Jews as Christ killers, blame the death of Jesus on the Jewish people. Whereas the Catholic Church, even going back to, we're not talking the Vatican Council, but we're talking the Catechism of the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church said that a Christian who commits a single sin is more responsible for the death of Jesus than all the Jewish people.
Yeah. And the current catechism is explicitly clear that it is our sins that killed Jesus.
Yes. Exactly. And that's really, what we say in the Good Friday, liturgy. This is what we acknowledge. And the Catechism also teaches that that in a mysterious way known only to God, all Israel shall be saved. And the Catholic Church, in the Catechism, in Nostra Aetate, is adamant that, as one document put it, that the Jews remain spiritually fertile, fecund. There's a document, a link to which I'll be very happy to send you, that was written by Archbishop Kevin Rhodes of the Archdiocese of Fort Wayne South Bend. It's called Friendship with Our Jewish Brothers and Sisters. Archbishop Rhodes wrote this a few years ago, and although he doesn't mention the Catholic E. Michael Jones, who's a resident of his diocese, basically, I think because of complaints against E. Michael Jones, Rhodes wrote this letter of friendship with our Jewish brothers and sisters, where he basically goes down the list without naming Jones of all these things that Jones has spread that are, hateful things against Jews. And he explains why it's not Catholic to believe these things. And among these hateful things that Jones spreads are the idea of Jews being Christ killers, and the idea that God no longer loves Jews, that God has forsaken Jews. And as Archbishop Rhodes says, pointing to the relevant documents of the Catholic Church, It's simply not true. Now, the Catholic Church does not teach that the Jewish covenant with God is separate from the Catholic covenant. We don't teach what's known as dual covenant theology. One document by the US bishops was recalled by the Holy See because it attempted to teach that there are two separate covenants. What the Catholic Church does teach is that Catholics who believe are saved by the same covenant that God made with the Jewish people, and fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And the Catholic Church also teaches that Jewish people in good conscience, good faith, who maintain their faith to what they understand as God's covenant with them, they have a hope of salvation. This is true of Jews, and also in a broader way, going outside of the covenantal theology, the Catholic Church also teaches, and this goes before Vatican II, this is in the Holy Office's letter to the Archbishop of Boston at the time when the Archbishop of Boston was dealing with the Feeneyites in, I think, 1950 or so. The Catholic Church even then made explicitly true that people who are not Catholic of any faith yet have the hope of salvation if they follow the lights that have been given to them. If they follow their best conscience, they may have interiorly a will where it's a will to be saved that just hasn't been, it's just that their intellect hasn't been enlightened by the knowledge of that the Catholic Church is what is going to save them. So that's the Catholic teaching, and it's terrible that people don't know this. And because people don't know this or are not willing to accept it, there remains a great deal of animosity towards non-Catholics. And sadly, and particularly one sees this in social media, there remains among many Catholics animosity towards Jewish people as well, and even Jewish converts to Catholicism, such as myself.
So this is going off my outline a little bit. My perception, so I'm asking if you think it's an accurate perception, is amongst groups, I'm not going to include Catholics who simply appreciate and value the pre-Reformed liturgy, the liturgy before Vatican II, but more like ideological traditionalist Catholics. I see more anti-Semitism within those groups as tied up in a rejection of some of Vatican II's teachings about salvation for those outside the Catholic faith, and specifically salvation for the Jewish people. Is that, do you think that that's an accurate perception that anti-Semitism is bound up in an ideological Catholic traditionalism?
I can tell you one thing, that speaking for myself personally, as a new Catholic, I was highly drawn to the traditional Latin liturgy, to the Tridentine Mass. And if I had not encountered anti-Semitism at in the coffee hour after Mass at Old St. Mary's, if I had not encountered anti-Semitism in books that are still printed and reprinted by tan books, if I had not encountered anti-Semitism from people who are reading the likes of E. Michael Jones in the traditionalist community, I would probably right now be among those who are, picketing Traditionis Custodes and complaining about restrictions on the Latin Mass. I will also say that because of being disaffected by traditionalism, because of being disaffected from traditionalism due to anti-Semitism, I went deeper into understanding how the Mass of Paul VI was created. I went deeper into understanding the relationship between the Mass of Paul VI and the documents it draws from the Second Vatican Council. I grew a love for the Mass of Paul VI that removes me further from being able to celebrate only in the traditional Latin Mass. I still would go to that. I still love it when I do go to it, rarely now. But, I no longer think I could be happy just being in the traditional Latin Mass. But, going back to your to your question, yes, I do believe that in those particular traditionalist circles, there's a festering hotbed of anti-Semitism, and the SSPX fuels that. And why that is, I don't know. There was a former member of the SSPX, first name Christopher. You may be familiar with him. He's written articles about anti-Semitism in the SSPX. He was a seminarian and he encountered Bishop Williamson. There have probably even been books written on why traditionalists are attracted to anti-Semitism. I don't think it has to do simply because of that they're drawing from a font of pre-conciliar writings. I think it has to do with a sense of wanting to be part of the Cathari, part of the church of the pure. And how does the church distinguish itself as being pure? Well, there has to be a scapegoat. There has to be an enemy. And who better than the scapegoat of, thousands of years, the Jewish people. So that's part of it. That's about as far as I would go in terms of trying to analyze the psychology of anti-Semitism in traditionalist circles.
Yeah. I want to move into, we've mentioned G.K. Chesterton a few times, and I think it was 2 years ago, 2 summers ago, you gave a talk at the Chesterton Society, specifically about your relationship with G.K. Chesterton and how he influenced your faith and still influences your faith, and but also really addressing head on his anti-Semitic writings. So I have a few different questions about that talk that you gave. The first is, could you briefly tell us who Chesterton is for anyone who may not know, and how and why he's influential in the church still today, a century after his time?
Sure. So G.K. Chesterton, who died in, I believe, 1936. I think that his dates are about 1874 or so to 1936. So he was an English writer, a convert to Catholicism from Anglicanism, and a great literary figure, a contemporary of other great British Catholic authors such as Tolkien and Christopher Dawson. And Chesterton, as I mentioned earlier, his writings were very important to my own conversion. It was through Chesterton's novel, The Man Who Was Thursday, that I first encountered the Christian understanding of the meaning of suffering, that suffering has meaning in and through the life, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And that was a transformative understanding for me. This idea that God, through the incarnation of Jesus Christ, has interior knowledge of suffering. God in his divine nature cannot suffer, but God has chosen to unite himself to a human nature that suffered and died. And that changes from our human standpoint, that changes our knowledge of how God knows us. God doesn't just know us from a distance. God knows us from our deepest interior, including God knows, even though God has never sinned, God knows how painful the effects of sin are on us. So Chesterton, I had great reverence for him, great respect for him, great admiration for him for many years. In my first book that I wrote, The Thrill of the Chaste, on chastity, I referred to Chesterton. And for that book, I was given the American Chesterton Society, now known as the Society of G.K. Chesterton's award that they gave each year. For 2007, I was given their Outline of Sanity award for having made like the greatest contribution to publicizing Chesterton. So, I first contacted Dale Ahlquist, the president of the American Chesterton Society, in 1996. 10 years before I became Catholic, and more than 3 years before I became a Christian, even. So I was deeply involved in promoting Chesterton, and even I was involved in some degree in promoting his cause for canonization. The Society of G.K. Chesterton has been for some years trying to get the church to recognize Chesterton as a saint. And I lent some of my resources to that in terms of trying to spread the word about why I thought he was a figure that should be held as some model for the church. I was always a little ambivalent about that, because I feel like it's the church's decision and I didn't want to push it too hard. Chesterton's important to me, whether or not he's a saint. But still, I lent some effort to that because Dale Ahlquist of what was then the American Chesterton Society asked me to. For the record, today, I think it would be quite harmful for Chesterton to be canonized, because what I now know about his anti-Semitic writings, which I wasn't fully aware of before.
Yeah. So that's my next question: is how did you first learn about and eventually then confront his anti-Semitism? And I guess, what was that experience like? Someone who was so foundational for you, and confronting something really ugly. Yeah.
It was very ugly. So early on in my reading of Chesterton, I found some pretty obvious slanders and mockery against Jews. I had to stop reading The Everlasting Man because Chesterton was presenting this Marcionite understanding of the Jewish people. I mean, he almost Marcionite, not totally, but he was portraying the Jewish people as these sort of quaint and bizarre characters who were no longer relevant because of Jesus. So definitely not what the church teaches, and also importantly, not what his contemporaries such as Christopher Dawson, or J.R.R. Tolkien were saying at the time. Although there were other contemporaries such as Hilaire Belloc, a good friend of Chesterton, who was saying things that were as bad, or even in many cases even worse, about the Jewish people. So when I first encountered those anti-Semitic writings of Chesterton, I wrote them off as being, oh, well, he was a man of his time. And if one is determined to forgive someone and to ignore or excuse someone, that is the easiest thing to say. He is a man of his time. We will often say that about Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, being slave owners. Oh, they were men of their time, blah, blah, blah. But, one of the benefits of I will say the Black Lives Matter movement, and not the organization, but the movement. And one of the benefits of other, forms of enlightenment in our time is that we are looking at past generations with a more critical eye. It doesn't mean that we should judge them totally by contemporary standards, because people were constrained in some ways by others' beliefs in their time. So like with regard to, if we're looking at early Catholic relations with Jewish people, we can see that, sometimes somebody who in today's, I'm speaking about medieval times, like with Bernard of Clairvaux or something, sometimes someone who today would not be considered a great champion of the Jews comes out as a great champion of the Jews in medieval times because of who he was surrounded by.
I've found in my own analysis of that is, and it's, Catholic moral teaching that has helped me frame this is like something is objectively good or objectively evil, regardless of the historical circumstances.
Yes.
But the historical circumstances can impact someone's culpability.
That's exactly right. And they impact someone's ability to really affect change, and they impact the pressures that are on a person. A wealthy landowner of a certain time with family members who are demanding certain things of him is under more pressure to have indentured servants or slaves than someone, at a later time. Again, that's not to excuse slavery in any way, but
it doesn't make slavery less evil or less grossly harmful.
Exactly. So with Chesterton, I was quite prepared for many years to give him a pass as being a man of his time. But once we do acknowledge if someone's a man of his time, then we do have to look at what are other people of the time saying. So it wasn't until very recently, when I was asked to speak at that Chesterton conference in 2021, that I thought, well, since I'm being asked to speak on behalf of Chesterton, my experience as a Jewish convert through reading Chesterton, then I should look and see what were other people of his time saying about Jewish people and how did he measure up. And then when I saw what Tolkien and Dawson had said versus what Chesterton had said, I was like, wait a minute, does not compute, because those people are aggressively going against Hitler and Hitler's anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and whereas Chesterton is publishing these sarcastic things where, he says things. This is what I discovered. I discovered like passages in Chesterton that were censored by Frank Sheed, who was his editor after Chesterton died. I discovered that, there's this famous passage in an essay of Chesterton's where he's supposedly chiding Hitler for beating and bullying poor Jews in concentration camps. But when you look at the entire context, which Frank Sheed edited out, Frank Sheed puts a full stop to Chesterton saying they beat Hitler's Nazis are beating and bullying poor Jews in concentration camp. What Frank Sheed edited out is where he says to the effect of, and what is worse, they are not beating and bullying rich Jews. So when you see it that way, it's like, whoa, oh my gosh. And then Chesterton in that same paragraph is really mocking and saying like, oh, but, say one thing for the Nazis. They had the great wisdom to burn copies of All Quiet on the Western Front. So it's like, wait a minute. He's writing in 1935. He knows that there are concentration camps where Jews are being sent. It wasn't the final solution yet, so he didn't know if Jews were being killed. He did know about the Night of the Long Knives, though, and he joked about that in the same in the same article. So he knows Hitler's killing people, but he still feels comfortable using his sarcasm and saying, well, at least the Nazis don't like All Quiet on the Western Front, which, Chesterton thinks is a bad book. So it's like, we just don't say that now. Like, it's not acceptable now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Among people who are Catholic, it's not acceptable to say, oh, well, Putin's slaughtering civilians in Ukraine, but, say this for him, he's against gay marriage. You know what? It doesn't matter. You don't say those things in the same breath. You don't say, oh, well, he's with us on social issues. No, you just condemn the slaughter of civilians. How hard is that? And Chesterton failed that simple test.
And I was looking back on your talk and the things you wrote about it. Please correct me if I'm misremembering, but doesn't he also Chesterton say something like the best thing about Nazism is Hitler himself?
Yes, he does. He says he finds things to admire in Hitlerism, and the most admirable thing is Hitler himself. And he also says some really freaky things, like he says that he says that the real error in Nazism is Nazism's Jewish error. So he blames the Jewish people for the Nazi understanding of the master race, which is so twisted. It's terribly, terribly twisted. He's blaming Jews for the ideology that is, he knows, persecuting Jews, not yet slaughtering them en masse, but he certainly knows persecuting them. He knows that there have been some killings. So my point with regard to Chesterton, I realize we're running short on time here, so I want to just make clear that I ended my address to the Chesterton Society saying that we need to have, as a Chesterton community, a reckoning similar to the reckoning that one has seen in other communities of admirers of certain artists, certain literary figures. The example I use is Wagner. There has come a time when Wagner could be performed in Israel. Wagner wasn't performed in Israel for many years, but finally Wagner was performed in Israel. And the reason part of that came to be was that the Wagner community was able to make it clear that in admiring Wagner, they weren't admiring Wagner's anti-Semitic views. And so there was a reckoning within the Wagner community where the community said, we condemn these views held by our hero Wagner. Those views are hateful, and they do not go into our appreciation of Wagner's music. If the Chesterton community were to do actual penance for Chesterton's anti-Semitism, and if they were able to say, it's because of the good things that Chesterton taught us that we are able to see that he did not live up to his Catholic ideals, and so we will do penance for his anti-Jewish writings. If they did that, then I'd be totally on board with, okay, yeah, make him a saint, because if he is even inspiring people to repent for his sins, then that's an inspiring person. But the Chesterton community is not doing that. Instead, they published on their website a point-by-point rebuttal of my address at their conference, complete with all these ad hominems, and they were doubting even facts that I shared that are totally verifiable. They even slandered Dietrich von Hildebrand in their attempt to rebut me, because I said that Dietrich von Hildebrand told his wife, Alice, that if after he died there was anything in his writings that should be found to be against the teachings of the church, she should burn them. And I said that's an admirable standpoint. That's what Chesterton fans should hold to. Maybe not literally, but at least they should believe that Chesterton would have said the same thing. And so the Chesterton Society, in rebutting me, says Dawn is making up this shameful story about Dietrich von Hildebrand. Well, all you have to do is look up an interview with Alice von Hildebrand where she says that's what her husband said. So they have to actually twist the truth in order to defend their hero Chesterton, and that's wrong. That's not the Catholic way.
Yeah, the so I think of the parable from a couple of weeks ago that we heard, where Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God is like a field with wheat and with weeds.
Yes.
On one hand, Jesus says, he says, "I'll take care of the weeds in my time." On the other hand, it's not that you ignore the weeds. It's not that you don't address them. There has to
Right.
be real honesty and truth that mixed in with the good is some really harmful and evil things.
Yes.
That type of honesty needs to be there in order for there to be healing and real progress.
I couldn't agree more.
As we're wrapping up, so in the spirit of like looking at things honestly, and you can answer this question as briefly as you would like. One of my heroes is a contemporary of Chesterton, and that's Maximilian Kolbe, Saint Maximilian
yes.
Kolbe. And I'm doing an interview with someone about him here next week, about his life and his impact. But there's also some accusations against him in some of his writings about anti-Semitism. What has been your assessment of Father Kolbe's role in that?
So I have researched Kolbe. I found that the newspaper, or one of the newspapers which he founded, did publish a number of anti-Semitic articles. That can't be ignored. I haven't read up on this in a while, so I would have to double check. Any information I give you is based on an earlier reading. I know now from my earlier misreading of Chesterton, where I excused him as a man of his time, that I have to be careful not to do that with Kolbe. But I will say that with Kolbe, first of all, there's very little in terms of anti-Semitism that, as far as I know, can be connected to him directly. He was a trusting person. When someone gave him a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, when he somehow came across it, which is a famous anti-Semitic forgery. Well, now we know it's a forgery. In his time, it wasn't so well known as a forgery. So I think he was concerned about it. But on his own, he didn't put his name on a lot of anti-Semitic articles. I think there may be some question in terms of how many of those articles came up at a time when he was actively editing the newspaper. I don't know that for sure. I'd need to check that. The one thing I absolutely know for sure, because I have studied the last months of his life, and towards the end of his life, before he was sent to Auschwitz by the Nazis, he sheltered, I think, more than 1,000, maybe even 2,000 displaced Jews at his Franciscan friary. So he certainly, towards the end of his life, understood the persecution, and unlike Chesterton, he materially helped Jews fleeing persecution. Moreover, definitely by the time he got to Auschwitz, he was a great friend of the Jews. There are testimonies from Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz that helped to work towards his canonization. They said that he gave them hope to live. They saw him, his generosity there. They spoke with him, and that he showed no prejudice, no, partiality in, with regard to them, that he only showed them the great love that he showed everyone there. And he didn't try to proselytize or convert them. He was simply fully himself a man of love. And, we can't say the same with regard to Chesterton's writings about Hitler towards his death. Even though Chesterton did say some critical things about Hitler in an interview, when we look after that interview, he's still saying that there are things to admire in Hitlerism and that it's too bad that rich Jews aren't being beaten up in camps. So there's a strong categorical difference between the saintliness of a Maximilian Kolbe and the all too human fallibility and errors of Chesterton towards the end of their lives.
Thank you for that explanation. I know you have to go in just a second, so I want to give you an opportunity first to say thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
But also, where can people find your work? Where can they follow you? And you've been promoting a new book over the past year quite a bit. I'll give you a moment to.
Yes, that's true. Thank you. So my book is called Father Ed, the story of Bill W.'s spiritual sponsor. It's a biography of Father Edward Dowling, who was a spiritual advisor to Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. And Father Ed can be found wherever fine books are sold. It really covers a chapter of AA history that many people don't know about, how this Jesuit priest helped the co-founder of AA to develop what's become known as recovery spirituality. And I'm online on my blog, The Dawn Patrol, which you can find at dawneden.com. That's DAWNEDEN.com. And also, as of right now, on Twitter at Dawn of Mercy, although given that it's now X, I might leave at any time. But I've been grateful to get to know people like you and Dominic and Mike Lewis of Where Peter Is through Twitter.
Oh, what a fantastic conversation. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Friends, if you enjoyed this, please hit that like button. It's going to help more people to hear more about what Dawn's had to say and share. And please subscribe to the channel. Yeah, check the links in the description, and we'll have included links over to where you can find her books and where you can connect with her. Paul, if our friends have a question or some feedback for this podcast, where can they go?
Yeah, you can visit us anytime or send me a message at popefrancisgeneration.com. And if you like this podcast and want to go deeper with the topics we discuss, check out Father's Heart Academy. There we're building a community for folks looking for compelling answers to their questions about church teaching, offering workshops and resources to help us share in a more beautiful gospel. That's fathersheartacademy.com.
Fantastic. And come and join Paul and myself in Smart Catholics. We are building the free online community for Catholic millennials, creators, and learners who want faithful conversations, unafraid of doubts and questions. And plus, we're free of trolls and ads and toxicity, at least 99.9% of the time. Join us at smartcatholics.com. Friends, till next time, say a short prayer for yourself and for us. And remember, don't be afraid to ask questions. Doubts can be a sign that we want to know God better and more deeply. God bless you.